excerpt from Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony happens at 2 minutes 23 seconds. If you're looking at the score, the YouTube video with the score, it is a melody, a theme presented by the cello and double basses, very understated, very subtle, very low, like all good bass melodies are. It's sort of an inversion of the main theme. The main theme is presented at letter C, the pickup to letter C. And as you may have noticed, this excerpt and really this entire symphony is noted for how chromatic it is. In this part of the symphony, the tonal center is often kind of shifting, so it can be pretty difficult to find exactly where you are. So practicing it on your own, intonation is very difficult. On that note, I would recommend kind of aiming for your peak notes as you're going through this melody. Kind of tuning to those. You could turn on a B-flat drone, at least just for those two measures. It'd be a lot of dissonance to it, but at least you'd be lining up with specific places that you're aiming for here. Keep in mind too, this melody, it is a melody. You are the primary voice, at least in the very beginning here. It's also a high romantic. I mean, Tchaikovsky is probably one of the greatest romantic composers that we know of. So basically that means, while it is piano, have a very full kind of tone and vibrate constantly. You always wanted to be vibrating and singing, unlike sort of the classical era and Baroque era, vibrato was meant to be constant here. I would also say, while you can find a variety of different styles, bowings, fingerings throughout this. Typically for an audition, you want to stick with the most safe, most middle ground. I would give just the lightest amount of space to all the separate notes in this. I've heard some recordings that are extremely legato, but I think generally you want it to be more of a bum 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 rather than ba 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 ba, or something more separated. That's wrong note. Or bum, bum, bum. Speaking of bowings, while there's a lot of different things you could do, I tried to do them mostly just as it came. The exception sort of being at the beginning, where I would do a retake so that the quarter note slur to an eighth note figure was always on a down bow. Something like this. You can see it's a lot of retakes. You can decide on or go some other way. Note, I forgot to mention, at measure 2, and I'm treating the first measure of this excerpt as measure 1. At measure 2, if you have that 8th note with a dot and 16th note, that should be slurred. That's just a misprint. Speaking of the quarter note slurred to an 8th note figure, I found that I really needed to think of that 8th note coming a little bit early so that everything afterwards didn't feel rushed. That's more of a mental thing than a technical, but it feels just a little bit on the early side, and I think that's exactly what you should be doing. As far as fingerings go, it would probably take me all day to go over exactly what I did, and in some cases I might be doing one thing for one rule and another thing in another place might break that same rule. It's really just a matter of comfort throughout all of this. Again, it's very chromatic. You're going to be doing a lot of very tiny shifts, but definitely just decide on exactly what you want to do, write it in, and never ever change it. That being said, of course, experiment with a few different things before you settle on it. Again, you're aiming for the most comfortable thing for your hand. One note at the very beginning here, I am doing a double extension effectively. If you can reach that and make it very consistently in tune, I recommend it. This was to avoid any string crossings or shifts that would make that figure a little bit too aggressive. Because as you can hear in the recording, it is just a very, very light entrance for the cellos there. As you're listening to it, definitely make a note of what's going on in the piece around you. The beginning, like I've said, is your melody, but then as soon as you get to measure 4, the oboes and flutes actually come in at our peak, at our mezzo forte. You're no longer the melody, it really kind of sinks into the background. So I would make a point of coming down there a little bit. And then finally, you come back in with the melody, the exact same melody, just up a perfect fourth there at measure 9. And so everything I just said about all of that is repeated at measure 9. And that effectively holds true until you get to, I believe it's 15, and have this little bridge section before finally the entire orchestra comes in tutti on the main theme. So at measure 9, the only note I'd say is that mezzo forte, the crescendo in there, can be a little bit more than the first time. As you noticed, I'm going on the A string this time, whereas I stayed on the D string the first time. But save your loudest dynamic for this tutti section, the forte getting into letter C. Throughout C, very similar things as I've already said. Just make sure it's loud, you're not losing any dynamic. Those accents really need to come out, and make sure you're not rushing on the 16th note passage. It's not terribly fast at this tempo. You may have noticed that if you do this bowing as it comes, getting into letter C, once the melody restarts at the pickup to measure 22, you will wind up on a down bow. I think this is totally fine. The best way to avoid it, if it is bothering you, would be to take a down bow on the E. I think it's just a little bit difficult to hide that or to make it not exactly stand out as an accent, which is the reason I didn't do it. But you can, I'm sure, find examples of orchestras doing that. There's a lot of variety in this bowing. I even saw one orchestra that was beginning this melody on a down bow. Something like that, and they wound up restarting it on a down bow, I believe. So a lot of options you can do, but for this audition, make sure you're just kind of picking the safest middle of the road options for a lot of things. One day, once you do get around to playing this in an orchestra, you might do some wild things to really make sure that it's the best sound that everyone is going for. But pick safer options for this. Final note, the very last note of this excerpt was also toying with doing a separate bow on that E. Again, just make sure it doesn't stand out if that is what you decide on, if you feel like you're just running out of bow once you get to it, because you want it to be sustained. You still want it to be loud. But yeah, just make sure it's not accented. I just decided not to do it. But this excerpt is just a terrific example of all the variety of things you can do, and your interpretation of this might be different from many of your friends. Well, that's all the notes I have on this excerpt. I appreciate you watching, and I certainly hope that these videos have helped you. At the end of the day, of course, you're going to have to be the one to practice these for yourself, doing anything that I've said or anything else, but just so that you're getting more and more comfortable with it every single time you play them. Practice with the drone, as I mentioned, or with metronome, as I mentioned in almost every video. and practicing with headphones in and a mute on so that you're just listening to the symphony around you and kind of playing along. Any of those things are a great idea, but nobody can practice these for you. So get back to work, I suppose, and good luck on your audition.